The session is going to start soon. Actually, we are already late. I know that you are enjoying very much the poster session. Actually, I did myself and I forgot the time. I'm trying to find the fastest speaker. Yeah, Omar. Okay, we will have two papers in the session about security evaluations. The first one is about back to Massey, the title is, the impressively fast, scalable, and tight security evaluation tools. The paper is written by, I don't know whether I should call you Omar or not, because I used to call you Omar before.
Yes, now I used to be called Marius.
Okay, Marius, Omar, Choudary, and
Pantelimon, George Popescu.
Very good. Thank you so much. And then Omar is going to give the talk. Yeah, this is your mic, yeah.
Yeah. Yes? No? Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm going to present you a very nice evaluation tool. So just before I go through the presentation, I want to tell you that this is something we didn't have before. So we couldn't really evaluate very large cryptographic keys in terms of side channel attack, like how much effort an attacker would need to do if it had a very good computer, let's say. So we managed to obtain a tool that can actually be used for very large cryptographic keys. This is basically what I'm going to present you about. But before I start, I want to say two things. First, I thank very much to my colleague, Pantelimon George Popescu, who is a great friend and my colleague at the University Polytechnic of Bucharest. And we had a great time in working in this. And it was kind of a miracle that we managed to pull this together, because it really came surprise after surprise. And I also thank Christ our God for all the help, because without him we couldn't do anything. Okay, so as we know, in side channel attacks we are looking after for some cryptographic algorithm that we want to attack. However, what I would like to recall, in particular for our tools, is that when we target a cryptographic algorithm, like for example AES, we typically look at some particular part of it, like for example the first round, and we look at the S-box computation, or maybe the last round. And as a result, side channel attacks really works on small parts of a key. So normally we are applying a divide and conquer approach and looking at 8 bits at a time. And then we apply the side channel attack on those 8 bits. Okay, then once we run the side channel attack, we often want to run a security evaluation. In particular, if you are an evaluation lab or if you are a chip manufacturer, you would like to know if the device that you've built is secure against these kinds of attacks. So we run these evaluations, and often if you even want to sell your chip, hopefully, you might want to get a certification like Common Criteria or EMV. So we need to run these security evaluations against side channel attacks. So they are useful and required as well. Now, because as I said, we use this divide and conquer approach, generally the classical evaluations until a few years ago were done on single subkeys at a time. And the most popular tools for that purpose were the guessing entropy, the success rate, and then later also the mutual information. There are others, but I mentioned here maybe what I've seen in papers as being the most popular. If we look at these evaluations on single subkeys, what we need for most of these tools is to get a list of probabilities or scores. For example, if you're doing correlation analysis, but for our purpose, we'll focus on probabilities. So after running a side chain attack on each subkey, you get a list of probabilities. the probability for the key, sub-key being 0, being 1, and so on. And you do that for all the sub-keys if you want to target, for example, the full key of AES or other cryptographic algorithm. And you can get these probabilities, for example, by running template attacks. By running template attacks, you can get these probabilities for each value of the sub-key. Okay, now if we look at the guessing entropy, which is the one that is of interest for our tools. It was proposed initially by James Massey in '94 and under the name of guesswork. And if we look at the form of this tool, we see that it's a summation over I and multiply with pi, where I is the position, is an index that goes from 1 to s, where s is the number of sub-keys in a sub-key. So for example, if it's 8-bit sub-key, s is going to be 256 here. And pi are the probabilities for each of the sub-key values, but sorted in decreasing order of their probabilities. So we need them to be sorted to apply this tool. And if you look at the form of this tool, you see that basically it's computing the expected value of the position, because if I is the position from 1 to 256, this is just the statistical expectation of the position. That's what Massey's guessing entropy give you. The statistical expectation of the position of the correct key, where it is expected to be. We are not sure 100% that it's going to be there, but this is the expectation, given all the probabilities. Now, the other tool that was actually much more used in most of the publications in sidechain attacks was actually a version of Massey's guessing entropy, which we call the guessing the empirical guessing entropy, which is also known as key rank. This was proposed by Standard and his group in 2006. And as I said, it's probably much more popular than Massey's guessing entropy for most of the sidechain evaluation that you've seen so far. And this one actually looks at the actual position of the correct key in the sorted list of probabilities. So you sort the probabilities and you look where is the correct key. So you do need knowledge of the correct key to see where it is located. So for example, if we have this list of probabilities here, and the correct value would be V2, then because this is the second probability, you would say that the guessing entropy is 2 in this case. If we look at the two of them, try to compare them quickly, basically Massey's guessing entropy gives you the statistical expectation of the position of the correct key, while the empirical guessing entropy gives you the actual position for a particular set of traces. And as I will show, for this reason, it could be a bit noisy as well. Massey's guessing entropy doesn't require knowledge of the real key because it just looks at the probabilities and estimates the position, while the empirical guessing entropy does require knowledge of the real key to tell you exactly at which position it is. Now, our claim is that although the empirical guessing entropy was used until now as the most popular tool, Massey's guessing entropy can be better than the guessing entropy for security evaluations in some scenarios at least. For example, when we have probabilities. And to convince you that this can be the case, we'll use two experimental data sets. One from a simulated data, where we took samples from the S-box substitution of AES. We took the Hamming weight of the output of the S-box, and we added some random uniformly distributed noise. And the other is a real data set which we took from an AES X-Mega microcontroller, where we're targeting the AES cryptographic engine. And here we use template attacks for profiling and LDA for dimensionality reduction. Okay, now I show you here the probabilities we obtained for an attack using a single attack trace. And here the blue stems are basically all the probabilities for the 256 possible values of the first subkey, sorted according to their probability value. With green, what we see here, the green stem, the tall one, is Massey's guessing entropy. And we see that it's around 128, as expected, because all the probabilities here are very low, so we don't have a clear picture of what is the correct value. So then that means that the correct key could be anywhere, because most of the probabilities have almost the same value. If it's not clear, these probabilities are smaller than 10 to the minus 3. So they are all very small. We also plotted here the standard deviation. We see that for Massey's guessing entropy, the standard deviation is very, very small. This is the purple line, the very thin one. So basically, Massey's guessing entropy is very reliable. On the other hand, if we look at the empirical guessing entropy, which is the stem next to it, the black one, It is close to Massey's guessing entropy. However, the standard deviation for that is huge. Is the red line at the bottom of the figure. That means that there is a huge variation. So this means that you need to take a lot of traces to actually get an accurate value for the guessing entropy. And that means in practice that you need to run a lot of experiments and you need a lot of time. So if you are a security evaluator, you are going to use much more time when using the empirical guessing entropy than Massey's guessing entropy. The same thing happens if we use more attack traces. In this case, we see that the probabilities start to converge towards the good value. Again, both measures are very close, but again, the standard deviation of the empirical guessing entropy is very high. We can also show that for the case of both experiments, when looking at the different number of attack traces, we see that in both the simulated dataset and the real dataset, the standard deviation for Massey's guessing entropy, which is the black line in these plots, is much higher than the standard deviation for Massey's guessing entropy, which is the green line. Okay, so this is so far for a single key. What happens now if we want to use these tools for more subkeys? So for example, if we want to target all the 16 key bytes of AES. Well, we have a problem because these tools do not scale. If we look, for example, at 2 bytes, and we look at the formula for Massey's guessing entropy, now we need to combine through a cross product the probabilities for each subkey list, so 256 with 256, to obtain a total of 65,536 probabilities. So first we need to compute them. Okay, we can compute them. Then we need to sort them as well. So this takes even longer in order to apply Massey's formula or even to compute the empirical guessing entropy. We can still do that for 2 key bytes. That's fine. But if you want to go now to 16 key bytes, that's really just not possible. You cannot compute so many probabilities and even sort them. So it's out of our hands. So what can we do? So in the past few years, about 5 years or so, there have been several algorithms proposed to overcome this problem. And they are known as key enumeration and rank estimation algorithms. The key enumeration algorithms, what they do, they take the value of the correct key and these lists of probabilities and they combine them somehow in order to provide you keys one after the other in decreasing likelihood. So they tell you, okay, this is probably the most likely value of the key, go and try it, this is the next one, and so on, until you try enough, hopefully finding the correct key if you find it. The other class of algorithms, rank estimation, they give you an upper bound and a lower bound for the position of the full key in the list of decreasing probabilities. So if you were to take all the possible, all the full keys, all the 2 to the 128 keys, for example, for AES, it would tell you where we estimate the correct key to be located after the side channel attack on all the subkeys. However, there are also limitations with this approach, with these approaches, and that is because they can only work up to a certain number of key bytes. For example, they cannot work with 256 key bytes or larger. This could be the case, for example, for RSA keys. And this is due to computation limitation and memory limitations. They require a large memory, and they would just crash when you try to use this with 2 large keys. So that means that until now, we didn't have any tools to evaluate really large cryptographic keys. So here it comes in our main result. We're able to find scalable bounds for very large cryptographic keys based on Massey's guessing entropy. These are fast. They can be computed in a fraction of a second for a 128-byte key. They are tight. They can be of just a few bits margin for a 120-byte key, and they are very scalable. They can work even for 8,000 bits key and even larger, as I will show you towards the end of the presentation. And furthermore, we have mathematical proofs for it. So they are guaranteed to provide you correct bounds for Massey's guessing entropy. So how does it look? It looks like that. So this, from mathematical literature, we were able to arrive at the following result. If we look, for example, at the left side of this inequalities, of these bounds, we see that they are actually easy to compute. They are just a product of terms, where the product goes from 1 to the number of subkeys. NS is the number of subkeys. And each term is just a sum of probabilities, where the sum goes from 1 to the number of subkey values. So for AES, NS would be 16, and S would be 256. So this is very easy to compute. The complexity is basically just depending on the number of subkeys and the number of values per subkey. And that means that we can, the computation only increases linearly with the number of subkey values, which is much better than what we had before. And we can even compute very easily the margins between the upper bound and the lower bound. So those can be computed immediately just using this formula. So that means that this tool is really scalable. Okay, to show you that this actually works, it's not just a formula. We can see here in this plot for the simulated and the real data set, we can see Massey's guessing entropy, which is the green line, and the empirical guessing entropy, the black line computed for 2 sub-key bytes. And we can see also our bounds, which are the blue line and the purple line below. So we can see that in both cases, the green line stays between the bounds, which was expected. Maybe as a minor comment for the real data set, we can see a small deviation between Massey's guessing entropy and empirical guessing entropy due to several reasons, like, for example, the fact that the guessing entropy has a much larger variation than Massey's guessing entropy, and also because you need to approximate very well the probabilities and for Massey's guessing entropy. And for the real data set, you might need more profiling traces to get a better approximation. Okay, now that we've seen that it works for 2 kibytes, let's go further. What happens if we try it on 16 kibytes? Well, now we cannot really compare it against the real guessing entropy from Massey because we cannot compute it. But in order to check if our bounds work fine on this, we decided to compare it against one of the rank estimation algorithms. Although it's not entirely the same thing because the rank estimation is providing bounds for the empirical guessing entropy, it still provides us a sort of reference level to see if we are close to it or not. So for this, we decided to use the rank estimation algorithm of Glowax et al. From 2015, which is probably the best until the moment in terms of time and tightness, although still not scalable above 256 byte values. Okay, so we see in this plot our bounds again in the blue and the purple line. And we see the bounds of Glowax et al. Through the red line. We see that they are very similar in both experiments up to a certain number of attack traces, and then they start to deviate slightly due to the difference between the empirical and Massey's guessing entropy that we discussed earlier. However, they are very similar for most of the plot. And what is important to mention is that in terms of computation time, our bounds only took less than 10 milliseconds for one iteration, that is for one line. Here in this plot, I forgot to mention, we show the average over 100 experiments. But for one experiment, our bounds took less than 10 milliseconds, while the rank estimation bounds took about 300 milliseconds per iteration. So it's much more. Let's go further. If we look at what happens for 128 kibytes, we can see that, again, we can compute very easily our bounds, and it only takes 150 milliseconds per iteration, while the rank estimation bounds require a few seconds for each iteration. Okay, can we go further? Yes, we can. And this is the point where none of the other algorithms could go. So this is maybe the first plot of this kind. Basically, we computed our bounds also for a 1024 byte key. That's already 8,000 bit key. Maybe you ask me, what do you do with this? Well, maybe you want to look at a very large RSA key when it's loading from memory to register, or maybe you want to try some of these fancy post-quantum algorithms where you have very large keys, or whatever is your application. But if you have such an application, this tool will help you. And we can see that the bounds are also quite tight. It's only 12 bits between the upper and the lower bound, and this could also be estimated very quickly by the formula we gave previously, in which you can find in the paper. And if we want to look at the computation time, if you want to compute it directly with the formula I shown before, you might have to use some variable precision arithmetic just because the number of probabilities is already too high to keep into a 64-bit value. So for this, we used MATLAB's variable precision, and this took already 70 seconds per iteration. It's not that fast anymore, but that's just because MATLAB is very slow, so hopefully you can optimize it better than we did. Another trick, if you want to do, is just take the logarithm of that. Take the logarithm, and then you don't have these problems anymore. And then it works again in less than a second. Can we go further? We could go further. I mean, I'm not sure how much we want to go, but we did it for this, and none of the algorithms could do it. And if you really want to see it, we did it yet for a even larger key this time. This. I apologize, the title here is not correct. We did it for 8,000 byte key. It's mentioned here correct, but not in the title. And we see that even here it worked well. This time, of course, it took much more, again, because of this MATLAB VPA that is very slow. But it works for really large keys. So you can go ahead and try it. So in conclusions, we think that Massey's guessing entropy can be a very valuable evaluation tool. our GM bounds provides the fastest and most scalable sidechain evaluation tool to date. And we can evaluate with this very large case, and I've shown results for even up to 8,000 byte key. You can read the paper for more details, and we've also made our code available if you want to try it for yourself. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We have plenty of time for questions.
How much time is it?
Yeah, at least 5 minutes. No question? Yeah, there is a question there. Can someone hand? Okay, I will do it. Okay, they are doing it. Good.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I would say rank estimation makes only sense if you have a corresponding key enumeration algorithm. So guessing the rank is meaningful if you know that an attacker can actually derive the key with the predicted effort. Can you link your work to a key enumeration algorithm that would produce those results?
We haven't looked into that yet. So we haven't looked into the key enumeration. But you can probably try to use one of the existing key enumerations because as we've shown before, the results for most of the part are quite similar. So yes, I guess at the moment we don't have that tool to actually give you that. This is just an estimation of the bounds because it comes from a mathematical derivation for an estimation for the upper bound and lower bound of the guessing entropy. So it's not an algorithmic approach like the approach that they use, for example, in the Gierlichs et al. Paper. That is an algorithmic approach, and that's why you can use it to enumerate tools, while ours is a mathematical approach where we just estimate the bounds directly. So basically, we look at the formula for Massey guessing entropy and we try to provide some bounds that are very easily computable. So it's a different perspective.
Okay, there is a question there. Can you please help?
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk. Do you think that there is a correspondence between the difference between guessing entropy and the original guessing from guessing expectation from Massey and the entropy and the mean entropy?
Well,
because it seems that you replace a mean, you replace the look for a maximum or a minimum of a score by mean, which was the original work by Massey, and it looks connected to the difference between computing an entropy and a mean entropy. Do you have an opinion on that, or is it?
I don't have a very strong opinion, so I prefer not to comment it because I haven't looked too much into that. But it's definitely linked to mean entropy because mean entropy is related to the original Massey's guessing entropy. So it's definitely a link there, but I haven't explored it too much yet.
Okay.
Maybe it's something we can do afterwards to look at this link.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other question? Actually, I have a question myself.
Yes.
Can you get back to slide 22 or 23? I'm not pretty sure. That you showed the result between the real and simulated data. Yeah. If I understand correctly, I mean, I'm just talking loudly. Here in the simulation data set, you have the purple line. That is actually the bound. Is it correct?
Yes, the purple line is the lower bound, yes.
And then if the curve that you have for your computation is going below this bound that you have, then it's a sign that you have a leakage?
Sorry, what do you mean? My computation doesn't go below the bound. It's just the black line that goes.
Exactly. I mean, it shows that it doesn't have any leakage here, right? Or it shows a leakage here for you. Because the idea is an evaluation tool. You want to check whether this design is leaky or not.
Yes.
Yeah. Then what the left figure is telling us that you have a leakage or you don't have a leakage.
Well, this is just the guessing entropy. So it tells you that, for example, for one attack trace, the leakage is very small. You still have about 12 bits of entropy remaining. But when you go close to 100 attack traces, you are leaking almost the entire key.
Okay.
So it's just the same as looking at the standard key rank, basically.
Okay. The result will not be logical 1 or 0 whether you have a leakage or not. It's based on the remaining guessing entropy.
Yes, it's basically the same result that the guessing entropy gives you of the key rank, yes. But it's clear here that as you go down towards 0, you have more leakage. I mean, you are leaking almost the entire key already.
Okay.
I think as long as you decrease below 15 bits for this case, you already have a leakage.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yes. Thank you. Any other question?
I think
yep.
Benedikt has a question.
Thanks for the talk. My question is, how does it scale with data? So you explained how it scales with, or you explained the memory consumption and so on.
Yes.
But so let's say if I don't have 100 attack traces or 1,000 attack traces, but if I have 10 million attack traces.
Well, so our algorithm basically works with probabilities. So I don't care how you compute the probabilities. You could have 100 million traces if you want. It's your job how you compute the probabilities for the attack that uses 1 billion or 10 million attack traces. You just give me the list of probabilities for that sample point. And when you have so many attack traces, it's your job to combine the attack for those million traces to obtain some probabilities. For example, if we use template attacks, what you do is probably multiply the set of probabilities in order to arrive at the probability that is using those 1 million attack traces. And then you take those probabilities as a list of 256 values, that is a value for each subkey, and you give it to our algorithm. So it's not dependent on this.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, there is a question there. I think we have, this should be a last question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lex and I'm in an evaluation facility myself. Maybe I'm totally beside the point, so forgive me if that's true, but the best of my understanding, if you do a template attack, the probabilities that you get are not probabilities with respect to one another. They are actually probabilities for each individual distribution that the attack trace belongs to that distribution. So for example, they will not add up to 1. I have the gut feeling that the formula you are using in the Massey sense requires probabilities that are meaningful with respect to each other. Am I off there, or could you comment on that?
No, you're right. So the probabilities that you need to use for Massey here, they need to be meaningful indeed. But the template attack does give you meaningful probabilities if you did your profiling correctly, and then if you applied bias afterwards. So after you get the posterior probability, you get meaningful probabilities that can be used here for Massey, because you get probabilities that sum to 1 for the 256 values. So they are correct in this case. You just need to apply bias after the template attack.
Okay, I'd like to have a chat with you about that bias process, but thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Let's thank the speaker again. Thank you. The second talk or second paper of the session, if it's not shown actually. It's called Fast Leakage Assessment. It's authored by Oskar Reparaz, Benedikt Gierlichs, and Ingrid Verbauwhede from KU Leuven. And Oskar is giving the talk. I'm using the time. Okay. Okay, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Amir. So in this paper, we explain how to perform leakage assessment fast. And we are in the security evaluation session. So we can consider the following strategy to evaluate the security of a device. And it's very simple. And the strategy is we make just a list, a very long list of all attacks we know. And then we proceed one by one to check if the attack applies or not. This strategy has many good things. For example, it can give you a very concrete feeling of the security that your countermeasures provide, which countermeasures are effective, which not. It can also have a series of drawbacks. It can be very slow. It can be a very expensive evaluation. And it's difficult to cover everything, right? I mean, either because time is not infinite, and maybe not all attacks are public. So this is in some way a good approach if you want to specifically test something, if you know what you should look for. But on the other hand, if you want to be comprehensive, that wouldn't scale much. So to illustrate this, we can consider how does the evaluation space look like. So in an evaluation, there's many variables that you can play with. For example, measurement setup. You can take power measurements. You can take EM measurements in some position, and you can play with those. You can fix your input texts in a specific way. You can choose certain intermediate variables to attack or others. And you can also, you have a lot of freedom in the, for example, in the statistical tools that you will use. That, for example, on the concrete distinguisher that you are using. For each of them, you can perfectly list a dozen possible values for each column. And then if you can take one of those, one instance of each column, combine them, and then you have a defined attack, right? You have one concrete attack. You can perform that and see if the result, if that attack applies to your device or not. Now you can see that the possible combinations of attacks explode, and this is normally a problem. So in some way, leakage assessment try to fix that, in some way try to mitigate that effect, and for that we can introduce a slightly different security notion. So typically we are concerned about key recovery, right? So at the end of the day, what we want is the device to be secure against an adversary that, by getting power measurement, he should not be able to extract the key, to pull the key out. This is a very pragmatic security notion, and for this, typically you rely on tools like DPI attacks or variants, templates, or others. Leakage detection tests are not really on that side of the picture, but they are based on a slightly different security notion that is more close to indistinguishability, that is also used in many other places in crypto. So here the question we ask is if an adversary can differentiate, can tell two devices apart that they are identical except they are keyed differently, based only on the side channel leakage. So this is a stronger security notion. It's more difficult to achieve this security than key recovery, let's say. And for this, you would rely on leakage assessment techniques. Failing to achieve indistinguishability does not immediately lead to an attack, does not mean that your device is automatically vulnerable. However, it's strong evidence that there's something wrong that could lead to an attack. In a similar way, leakage assessment techniques, they do not try to extract keys, but potentially point out to potential flaws that may later be exploited for key recovery. So leakage assessments were introduced almost 17 years ago in a very nice paper in Financial Crypto 2000, Statistics and Secret Leakage. And very briefly, how these techniques work is first we should define two sets, two classes, two plaintext classes, and for each class we take a bunch of measurements, and for each set of measurement we compute some statistic and we check if the statistics are the same for the two classes. If they are the same for the two classes, then the test passes. The test has not detected any statistical difference between the two sets, and otherwise the test fails. So you can see here that already we didn't fix, for example, any specific intermediate. So that choice that we had to make before of which exact intermediate are we targeting, here we didn't do it. So we are somehow targeting many intermediates at once. Also, with the distinguisher of the statistical tool here, we are not really covering all possible distinguishers, but we are covering more than one. This is perhaps the most simple instance of a leakage detection test or leakage assessment test. So suppose the parameter we are interested in finding differences between the two sets is means, are the means, the distribution means. So any statistics textbook, I would tell to use some kind of test such as Bell's t-test that looks something like that. where you have to mix, where you have to plug estimated means and estimated variances, and then you get a statistic value. And in the case of non-specific first-order t-test, you would define your traces, your classes in a spatial way. For example, one set of traces would correspond to a fixed spatial value, and another set would correspond to a random value. There is a lot of details how to specify this, but this is not really important for this talk. What we are concerned here is how to compute this statistic, that value, in a computationally efficient way. Okay? There are many generalizations of this test. We can test instead for equality of means, we can test for equality of variances or higher order moments. And this is really useful, especially when we are evaluating mask implementations, because we can really test which specific security guarantee, if the specific security guarantees that your masking should provide are actually being provided. So we can now state our problem. So we want to compute efficiently all statistical moments up to a certain order, given samples of that distribution. So there are some important practicalities here. Mainly, we are also interested in online algorithms, in one-pass formulas, so procedures that we can take one trace, do something with the same trace, and throw it away. We don't need to store it in a hard disk or something. That would incur in some non-negligible overheads. And we are dealing with potentially many traces, hundreds of millions, something like that. Maybe long traces, up to, I don't know, 50 megabyte traces. And you want to be aware of numerical stability issues, mainly because you are using millions of traces, for example. And at the end of the day, of course, you want to trust whatever comes out. So the current state-of-the-art way to do this was introduced in a very nice paper in 2015, CHES 2015, Tobias Schneider and Amir Moradi. And among several contributions of this paper, one of them was some explicit set of formulas to compute these statistics. So this approach, the approach of these authors, was to start with samples, with distribution samples, that is with power measurement traces, and from there go directly to statistics of the underlying distributions. Okay, so and for that they give an explicit set of formulas that they look like that, and this is perfectly fine. This, of course, it works. The one possible drawback is that, well, these are simple formulas, but can get messy. Just there is a lot of additions and multiplications. At the end of the day, it's just addition and multiplication and divisions, but there are lots of them. And yeah, you have to compute all of them every time you get a new trace, right? So that can be computationally expensive. So the contribution of this paper, I mean, of the paper I'm presenting, is to divide this. At the end of the day, we arrive to the same place from the same originating place, but following two smaller steps. So that's the main contribution of our paper. So we introduce an intermediate representation, let's say, and that is the densities of the distribution in such a way that going from samples to densities is extremely easy, and also computing any statistic from densities is also computationally light. The main observation, or the main reason we can do this, is because the traces are the samples are integral values. So I mean, the ADC value that you get that you retrieve from the scope is form of 8 bits. It's not a real number or something like that. It's just an integer between 0 and 255 most of the times. So in a nutshell, what we do is we divide the problem in two steps. The first one is we build a histogram based on measurements, based on each trace. So for each trace, we have to update a histogram. We keep the full distribution of each measurement set. And then the second step is from each histograms, every time we want to check, if, for example, the device leaks, every time we want to check, we want to compute the t-value, then we'd have to compute statistics only from those histograms, which is also really trivial. This is the same thing as I have explained with words. And just a picture to illustrate a bit. So on top, we have a power trace corresponding to a hardware AES core, just 3 cycles of the execution. And what we do is, for each time sample, we keep a histogram. So on bottom, I have plotted a histogram. So it counts the number of times that the power trace at that time sample takes the value indicated in the x-axis. So the x-axis ranges from 0 to 255. And we can see, for example, that at that time sample, well, the traces take more or less are centered around value 200. We repeat this process for every time sample. So actually, there is not a single histogram, but there is a whole family of histograms, 1 per time sample, and actually 1 per class as well. So double the time, two times a number of histograms. And that's the intermediate representation that we keep, and we update every time we get a new trace. When we want to compute the real t value, they will need to process that histogram. We prototype an implementation, this very simple concept, in around 100 lines of C, so it's extremely compact to implement. Using 32-bit counters for histograms, that means that you can use up to 4 billion traces, which we deemed comfortable, without risk of overflowing. If you assume, for example, that your ADC is 8 bits. One observation is that you no longer need to rely on single-pass algorithms for computing variances, because you compute variances from your histograms. And there, it's OK to compute variances in 2 passes or 5 passes. The important thing is that traces are acquired once, the histograms are updated, and then you can throw them away. So this means that you can use many possible ways for computing variances. We use actually a single pass method because we just had code already tested and tried for that. So as a first result, we can give you some numbers. We take, for example, 1 million measurements that are 3,000 times long, so that would be a shortish trace, for example, corresponding to a hardware implementation, something like that. Pretty standard compiler. My workspace, my desktop computer in the university, so not really fancy cluster. And if we went to compute up to order 5, we would spend 10 seconds for the first step of building histograms and another extra second for computing t-values from those histograms. That makes a throughput of around 300 megabytes per second, which is about 500 to 800 times faster than previous state-of-the-art solutions. This data set is synthetic, it's not actual traces, and actually they are uniformly distributed, so that you could argue that this is like worst possible case in terms of cache access. And memory requirements are manageable. In this case, when you have 3,000 times samples long traces, then the 2 histograms, holding those 2 histograms, you could fit them in L2 cache. It's about 6 megabytes. So this was essentially it. Now I'm going to give you some more analysis, but this was essentially the key idea. The method scales more or less well with respect to a series of parameters. Here we see how much time we spent in the first step, that's densities estimation, and in the second step, that's statistics computation. So first step is in blue, and red step is in red. Sorry, the second step is in red. So we plot runtime against the length of the trace, against number of traces. As we throw more traces, we see that it grows linearly. The first step, that's the density estimation. And the second step takes constant time because it doesn't depend, of course, on the number of traces. If we increase the trace length, it also scales linearly, actually not completely linearly because there are memory hierarchies, and the memory hierarchy will impact this, the shape of this curve. And also, if you want to compute many orders, many statistical orders, then that will not impact the time you spent in the first step, computing densities, but that will only impact, obviously, time in the second step. Yeah, the takeaway is that we can perform significantly faster. What took before around 3 CPU months, it's now possible to do it in 4 CPU hours. And there's some extra nice things that we can talk about. So the first thing is that actually we could compute the exact t value. So there is no floating point approximation, there is no numerical stability issues, just the exact t value. Because we could carry out all the computations using fractions. I mean, working in Q, using sum of fractions and multiplication of fractions. This can be really useful if you want assurance. You need assurance that the result is correct. So yeah, we implemented this using GMP, and of course it incurs in an overhead, especially in the second step, only in the second step, but it's perfectly manageable. Secondly, we could apply another more elaborated density estimation methods based on kernels, for example. You can apply kernels after you have estimated your histograms by linearity. And you can also play with different kernel parameters, bandwidth or shape or anything, after you have taken traces and analyzed them. So this is useful, for example, if you want to play with many parameters. You don't have really to take new traces or read the traces again, but you can just play with the histogram. We can also apply arbitrary preprocessing functions. So here we have the typical thing to do would be to do first order and second order and fifth until dth order tests. That means tests on traces, tests on on center and square traces, on center and cube traces, and so on. But you could also apply other preprocessing functions that may work better or may not. Absolute value or any arbitrary other function. You can take this to a little bit to the extreme, and you could use an information theoretic statistic to compare the two distributions. You could compute an infinite number of moments, so you can just compute mutual information or Kolmogorov-Smirnov tests or any other information theoretic test, possibly combined with the previous, with another fancy density estimation based on kernels, for example. And last but not least, given the histogram, you can detect whether your trace is clipped or not. And you can detect this retroactively, let's say. You cannot fix it, but you can at least detect it. And you don't have to, so you would not really need to test each trace, but after the histogram, after you have collected all the traces, you can do a double check that, and you can be sure that none of the traces clipped. So this turned out to be useful in our setup. So in conclusion, we have presented a methodology to significantly make faster leakage assessment techniques. This is extremely easy to implement in about 100 lines of C, and you can improve in several orders of magnitude this time, the computational time you are spending in this kind of evaluation. And we actually wrote this in summer 2014, and we have been using it in our lab since then, almost every day. And this is what we use regularly to test our designs. And I finish with the statement that actually trace processing in our setup is no longer the bottleneck. So we are limited by other factors, but not by processing traces. So this was everything. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions.
Thank you. Any question? Here, please. I can give you my mic.
Thanks for your presentation. I have one question about your histogram steps. Since the result in your presentation are based on the byte format of the traces, and it's very convenient for your hist. But how about the performance if the traces are acquired with float type? Float type.
Part, if you're
I mean, if they float type, then the histogram is not that easy to plot to store, right?
I agree. I'm not aware of any ADC that returns raw floating values, but yeah, if that was the case, then yeah, you will need bigger histograms. After preprocessing, for example, squaring.
You also mentioned the sine function.
Sine function.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, but you can still do it. Your bins will not take integral values, but you will have 256 bins.
Okay. Any other question?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Actually, I don't have a question about your contribution introduction of histograms, but on leakage assessment in general. It remains some assessment, it remains univariate, actually. You will estimate one histogram per time sample and compare it. So actually, you can do it up to any higher order, but you don't consider multivariate statistical moments. Do you think that it is sufficient to make your leakage assessment?
The question, the last question, sorry?
So did you make that it is sufficient to just evaluate univariate statistical moments to decide if two highly multivariate distributions are the same or not?
I think it's not enough. But you can still do multivariate leakage assessment. Huh? There is no, yeah.
Okay.
Conceptually, it's the same. In practice, it's much more expensive, but yeah.
Of course. And may I ask you a second question?
I think
in
we
practice,
run out of the time. If you leave it for the coffee break, would
okay.
Because the next session should start, right? Sorry, I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Let's thank Oscar again.
All right, thank you. Okay, we're now going to the last session of this morning. It's on field programmable gate array security. We have two papers in this session. The first paper is on a side channel leakage countermeasure, or better, on breaking a side channel leakage countermeasure. It's presented by Robert Specht, and the paper is by his co-authors, Vincent Immler, Robert Specht, and Florian Unterstein at Fraunhofer.
Yeah, so thank you for the introduction. I'm going to talk about localized EM attacks on dual-array precharge logic. So why should we actually need dual-array precharge logic? So when you have your circuit, like for example an AES box, and you simply put an shunt resistor in front of the circuit, you actually have a data-dependent voltage drop across this resistor, and this is due to data-dependent switching activity of the circuits inside the box. So the idea behind dual-array precharge logic is now that you don't have one line anymore. You add a second line, which works inverted to the other one. And due to this behavior, you get always the same switching activity, independent of the data you put in the S-box or whatever you implement there. And so the trick is to actually place both paths, the true and the inverted path, into the same slice. Hence they are more or less combined together. And you have to solve different problems like individually route every path. So how does dual-array precharge logic actually work? So the most important thing is that you have two operating phases. One is called the precharge phase. The other one is called the evaluation phase. during precharge, you you just take both paths, true and false, to the same level, so both 0 or both 1. And now during evaluation, you change to 0, 1 or 1, 0. So at this way, you have always one line switching, independent of the data you actually applying. So when you actually implement this and synthesize the design, you optimize, or in an optimal case, get false and true paths parallelly routed with the same length, and the capacitances of both rails are the same. So when you now put an EM measurement probe exactly in the middle, you will have no leakage. Of course, this is only the most ideal case. In practice, placement and routing is very, very difficult to control on FPGAs. Hence, you see effects like that one line is actually longer routed than the other. Hence, the probe is closer to, for example, the false path than to a true path. Or in another case, you will have an imbalance of these capacitances, and due to that, you will, you have also on data-dependent, timing behavior of both signals, and you also measure leakage. So these are just two examples what can happen in practice and what you can still exploit. Even if you implement this countermeasure with the help of power analysis or EM analysis. So a lot of publications show that these countermeasures work really, really well against power side channel attacks. But what's about resistance against local EM attacks? So local EM attacks provide a really high spatial resolution, and hence they are probably, or hence they may be able to actually resolve both lines and get or measure much more leakage than a power side channel. So what we did, we implemented 4 logic styles on Spartan 6 FPGA. We clocked the FPGA with 8 megahertz. We had 1 single rail logic style and 3 different dual rail logic styles on FPGAs. The single rail logic style was simply implemented by deactivating 1 line of these dual rail logic styles. Due to that, we see a similar behavior for the single rail implementation, like evaluation in precharge, because this just made our life easier and it's easier to compare to the dual rail logic styles. So during this talk, we only show 2 logic styles. DPL no EE is just 1 dual rail logic style we analyzed, and the single rail. So how we actually performed our measurements. So for our EM measurements, we placed the DUT on an XY table to be able to move the probe really precise around and find the place of highest leakage about the die. Afterwards, we took 10,000 traces for each logic style. For power measurements, we kept the same bit file for the FPGA, but we changed the measurement setup and took a shunt resistor and a differential probe and collected 100,000 traces for each logic style. During the presentation, we will show a correlation-based leakage test. So we will see first order leakage, and the leakage test works similar to a profiled CPA. So you profile your power model, and hence this is suitable for dual rail and single rail logic styles. And complementary results you will find in a paper with also other leakage tests. So let's get to the power measurement first. Like I said in the beginning, you see the two phases, the evaluation phase around here, and the pre-charge phase around here. In total, you see about one clock cycle on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, you see the correlation coefficient of our leakage test. So, yeah, you see quite significant difference in the correlation, and in total, you get a security gain of 425. Means you need, or to break the dual rail implementation, you need 425 times the measurement like for the unprotected single rail implementation. Okay. So we also performed measurements with a 3mm probe and got similar results. When you now go to the EM side channel, everything looks a little bit different. Firstly, you can distinguish both phases, so evaluation and pre-charge much better means you have a signal with a much higher bandwidth. And you see, when you look at the maximum correlations, that they are almost the same. So we get a security gain of only 1.3 anymore. So yeah, compared to the power measurement, this is a really drastic impact. And we also had, or we took measurements with different measurement probes, one 100 micrometer probe and one 250 micrometer probe, and these all led to similar results. So yeah, now the question is, what can we do better? So can we fix this? So we thought about, okay, maybe the placement is not really good. Maybe we should try to do a tighter placement and get less leakage. Because when you place the single gates more together or more tightly, you should become shorter routes and also more uniform ones. So we tried different metrics for placement, and we checked if the resistance can be improved. So the whole workflow was based on an open source placer called RapidSmith. So basically, in the first step, we let do the Gierlichs ISE do the placement. We took the netlist, converted it to XDL, and we did our custom placement with RapidSmith. After we changed, or afterwards, we put the finally placed design back into the Gierlichs ISE and performed the routing step. And afterwards, we generated the bit file and took measurements. So the first metric we used was a simulated annealing approach with the so-called HPWL metric. So how it actually works. So for instance, you got three parts connected with a net. Then you simply draw a bounding box around all three parts and add up the Manhattan distance of the frame, more or less. So, and you try to minimize the length of this bounding box. When we do this, we get something like this on the right. So that means we get a security gain of about 1.15, which is again, yeah, not really good. So we thought, okay, let's do an own approach. So we came up with an FPGA, specific placement style, and we tried to cram up as many components in the same slice and in the same tile as possible. So we more or less we counted the distance and number of tiles as a score, and if it's in the same tile, it's counted with 0.5. If it's actually in the same slice, it's weighted with 0. And this way, you actually try to get as many components in the same slice or in the same tile as possible. And like we saw, this actually helps to reduce the leakage a little bit. So we at least got factor 2 of security gain compared to the single array implementation. So yeah, it makes it better. Yeah, to conclude, we performed measurements on an FPGA, and all dual rail pre-charge logic dice showed a really high security gain during power measurements. But for local EM measurements, this high security gain was only reduced dramatically. With an optimized placement scheme, we at least got factor 2 improvement. So yeah, this means a severe security impact if you use local EM measurements on this kind of logic dice. Yeah, but also it means when an attacker is only able to perform power measurements, then this is quite a good solution. Yeah, what could we do for future work? So firstly, due to the limited control about like routing and so on, you could try to implement this on an ASIC. There we have much more control and probably get much better results. And you could try a combination out of placer and router, and it would be interesting how this actually influences the leakage. Yeah. So far so good. Do you have any questions?
Thank you. Are there questions?
Thank you very much for the presentation. You are making routing optimization, but I think 2 gates driving the rails are essentially different, so they can be a cause of leakage. So my question is, can you distinguish the leakage by gates from those of rails? Do you have a comment on it?
So I'm not sure if I got the question right. So we did a placement optimization. Yeah. So we just placed the components, and afterwards we let ISE do the routing. So we hoped when we do a better placement, it will result in a better routing. And yeah, I'm not sure if this answers your question. And
actually, no. The thing is that the dual rail is driven by 2 gates that's composed of dual rail logic, right? And upper side and downside of the gates are essentially different.
Maybe we take this offline. And
yeah. Okay, let us discuss later. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take this offline. Another question?
Okay, thank you. I have two questions. I try to keep it short. In the correlation figures that you showed, which model did you use? What is the correlation between which things?
So as a power model?
Yeah.
So we always profiled for every logic style. So we profiled for single rail and we profiled for dual rail. Like we took the means of every possible value between 0 and 255. And then afterwards we correlated with them.
Mm-hmm. And the other question is, can you get back to your slides?
Which one?
Nestle, I forgot. Okay, probably I don't waste your time. Probably is there any other question? I will do it offline. Sorry.
Question?
Hello. Yes, I just had a question regarding your last graph when you showed us the gain for the EM analysis. I was just wondering, in this case, what is the gain for power analysis?
Oh, the gain for power analysis?
Yes.
So here we got a gain of about 420, so 425 in this case. So we used the exact same bitwise during this and during this measurement. So the only difference is actually measurement setup.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
so basically, when you do the placement, the last placement, I was just wondering, do you also have this security gain, or it increases with the placement approach?
So when we perform our custom placement, it stays for the power side channel about the same.
Okay, that's what I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Let's thank the speaker. So we now move to the second paper, which goes into the field of field programmable gate arrays that have also cores on them. So they call them FPGA SoC. And so the presenter is Nisha Jacob from Fraunhofer TUM. And together with her co-authors, Johann Heyszl, Andreas Zankl, Carsten Rolfs, and Gierlichs, she's going to present how to break secure boot.
Yeah. Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Nisha Jacob from Fraunhofer Isaac, and I will be talking to you today on how to break secure boot on FPGA SoCs through malicious hardware. So this talk might be slightly different from the rest of the talks that you heard today. In that respect, I mean, it's focused more on the ES of the CHES rather than the CH. Let's get started. First things first, what are FPGA SoCs? So FPGA SoCs are these new platforms that include like a CPU along with an FPGA fabric on the same die. Now this means that in addition to your high-performing CPU, you can now also include custom hardware accelerators. With this, you again have the added advantage that you can not only provide in-field updates to your software, but also your hardware. Like for example, if you consider putting some communication interface as part of your configurable logic, then you can always update these interface to fit new standards, for instance. So as a result of this, we're seeing like more and more embedded systems switching to these more contemporary platforms, namely the FPGA SoCs. But of course, this comes with its own set of challenges. Now, where do all of these hardware cores come from? Now, if you just imagine like a typical software development environment, due to the lack of time and the skill to develop these hardware cores, the designers might often resort to outsourcing the hardware development or even like buying their hardware cores from some third parties or some IP stores. And as you see, there is more and more of these IP stores coming up. Amazon Web Services, for instance, now also offers like a marketplace where you can buy and sell hardware IP cores. Yeah, so with this, now let's just switch to a completely different topic, which like on the software world, if we have a look, everyone's familiar with the software applications now. A simple example I've taken here is like your flashlight apps. Yes, they are meant to provide simple applications so you can use a flashlight. But if you look closely, in addition to providing this flashlight application, they also require access to your location and your network settings. This is simply not necessary and unwanted, but it's there. So what's stopping people from doing the same in hardware? Yeah, so you basically, again, when you buy such cores from third parties, you need to be sure that they do not have additional functionalities. But here, I guess everyone in this room will agree that testing and verifying of hardware cores requires a lot of time and skill. And it's also often the case that you only receive these IP cores as a netlist, which makes it even harder to verify such cores. Now, once you have such malicious functionality in an IP core, that could be quite critical in the sense that it could corrupt some data or even memory and cause like privilege escalation. Now, this brings us, how do we trust the vendor? Can we trust it? So coming to the main part of the talk today, secure boot. Secure boot is one of the most important security mechanisms for embedded systems. Now, this is like the base on which all later security mechanisms will be applied. So what we want to achieve through secure boot is we want to ensure that all the code that you wish to execute is verified before they are actually running on the system. Now, such that at the system startup, you are running a trusted code base. Now, secure boot is established by building a chain of trust, starting from some sort of hardware core root of trust. Now, this hardware core root of trust is typically some keys in eFuses or even just some code in the ROM. So this brings me to the main contributions of my talk today. I would first like to show you how secure boot on such FPGA SoCs can be broken. And in that, I will show you a proof of concept on the Xilinx Sync FPGA SoC. The Xilinx Sync 7000 is made up of a dual-core ARM Cortex-A9 along with Xilinx 7 series FPGA. Now, once I have shown you this, how does this scale? So for this, we want to see what is the impact of such an attack on commonly applied security mechanisms. And additionally, how does this affect other available FPGA SoCs today in the market? And finally, I would like to show you how you can protect your system against such threats. And there, I would also like to show you a simple countermeasure we developed for countering such threats. So let's get started. So before we go into the details about the attack itself, I think it's important to know how secure boot on the Zinc works. Yeah. Secure boot on the Zinc is divided into several stages. Upon power up, the boot starts with the boot ROM code. Here, that's the root of trust, basically. The boot ROM holds some unencrypted code, whose main task is then like to start up the system and hand off control or hand off control to the next stage. But before it does that, it needs to verify that this is a trusted code. So Xilinx offers basically lets you encrypt and authenticate your code and also optionally sign it. So you can encrypt and authenticate using the AES and HMAC hard IP cores, and additionally, you may also sign them using an RSA. So as I said, at power up, you first need to verify the signature. After you verified the RSA signature, you have to redirect these encrypted bit streams or encrypted partitions to the AES and HMAC cores. And once they have been authenticated, control is now handed off to the first stage bootloader, and the boot ROM goes out of scope. Now, the first stage bootloader in our case is just a standard bootloader provided by Xilinx. You could also customize it if you wish. The main function of this is early system initialization, following which it then is in charge of loading the next partition, which is then typically some FPGA configuration. Again, before the FPGA fabric is configured, the signature is checked. The encrypted bitstream is redirected to the AES and HMAC cores. And finally, the FPGA fabric is configured. Next, the first stage bootloader loads the U-boot. A second stage bootloader. I think it's a standard bootloader, open source. And again, signature is verified. Decryption and authentication is done. At the end of this, control is now handed off to the U-boot. U-boot again continues with the system initializations and all of the peripherals initialization and so on. It completes the whole initialization of the system. At the end of this, it is then in charge of loading the next partition and handing off control to it, which in your case is then your final operating system if you're using an operating system, or if you're just going to use a bare metal, then a bare metal application, for instance. But here, so then before it does this, it again needs to verify it, so on. And at the end of it, you have an operating system running on your CPU and all of your custom hardware accelerators on your FPGA. This here is a very simplified view of an FPGA SoC. You see the two main components, the CPU and the FPGA fabric. In addition to this, you will see that all of your trusted images in the non-volatile memory. And after power up, you will see that I will go into that. But before we go into the details about how the attack is going to work, I think there's two points that need to be highlighted. The first one being the process that does the verification and the process that hands off control are not done in the same place, which means that it can be interrupted. And now if you look at such a system, compared to your traditional SoCs, you have a new attack vector, the FPGA fabric. Now this cores in this FPGA fabric have access to shared resources, like for instance the bus system. Now a rogue actor in this FPGA fabric can corrupt your entire system. And this is exactly what we tried to do. So after power up, what we want to do is use this rogue actor in our FPGA to take control of the CPU. So boot process begins as usual. We've loaded the first stage bootloader. The FPGA has been configured. And now U-boot has also been configured. And control has been handed off to U-boot. As I already said, U-boot is busy doing system initializations, which means we still have this nice gap between which U-boot does the verification or does system initialization and finally loads your next stage with your operating system. Our rogue actor in the FPGA fabric, in the meanwhile, begins to scan the memory where U-boot's loaded. Now here, what it does is it scans the boot parameters for the next stage. So it begins to scan for where U-boot is actually going to do the verification and hand off control. And then it overwrites this such that instead of loading this trusted image that's located on the non-volatile memory, it overwrites it such that a malicious operating system can be loaded from some remote server. And we were able to do this successfully without raising any alarm. We took control, and now we have your malicious operating system running on your CPU. So if you look at a timeline of these attacks, as I already said, you have in the beginning where the first stage bootloader is verifying the FPGA and then configuring the fabric, and then you still have the time where U-boot needs to be verified and then loaded into the memory. And then we have a beautiful time space in which we can, this little red block that you see is the time that we actually use to run the exploit. So if you compare this to the rest of the timeline, you see that it's already relatively small. But this can be further minimalized if, as you know, U-boot's an open source software. So if you look at it a little more closely, you can significantly reduce the amount of space and memory you need to scan and find your desired parameters. But how does this work? I mean, how can we generalize this? First, we wanted to know what is the impact of common security countermeasures that you use for embedded systems. I think one of the most common countermeasure that comes to a lot of people's mind here probably is the IOMMU. Now, an IOMMU's one of the main functionalities of an IOMMU is to prevent unauthorized accesses to the memory by peripherals. Also, another main function of the IOMMU is to enable virtualization, which is then typically done by the operating system, as a result of which IOMMUs are also typically initialized by the operating system, which in our case, you saw, is already too late. We've already taken control of the operating system. And another problem is the IOMMUs are only present in the newest of devices. So the older generations, like even the Zinc 7000, do not have an IOMMU. And also these newer generations are much more expensive in terms of resources and just cost. So yeah, that doesn't really help us. The next common countermeasure that you see is the trust zone. A goal of the trust zone is to divide your system into two worlds, a secure and a normal world. So you want to use then the secure world to protect all of your sensitive cores and data, and you want to prevent access from any normal world into this secure world. But if you look at crypto cores, since they handle sensitive data, they're usually typically running inside of your trust zone. And if you consider such a malicious functionality to be part of your crypto core, you've basically taken control of your whole system. Now, even if such a malicious functionality is part of an IP core in the normal world, U-boot, for instance, is usually also running only in the normal world. And as you can see, that's all that's enough for us. We've taken control of the normal world. But how does this scale to other FPGA SoCs? Now here, as you may have noticed, we were able to, one of the reasons this worked was because we were able to initialize the FPGA quite early. But this is usually also the case in other devices. So let's begin with the next generation of the Zinc 7000, which is the Zinc UltraScale Plus. Yes, it also follows a similar boot process, but Xilinx has also added some additional countermeasures here, namely the XMPU, which then allows dynamic memory restrictions from very early in the boot stage. But again, this is much more expensive when compared to the Zinc, and also, I think, targets more resourceful applications. Altera, on the other hand, offers different boot processes, where you may boot your FPGA first, and the FPGA is then in charge of the CPU, or you boot them independently. It sure makes sense to initialize your FPGA rather early on in the boot process if you consider using some hardware accelerators then to speed up your boot process. But even so, in those cases, this attack makes it much nicer for us. But yeah, so the success here maybe will depend on whether the FPGA is booting before the operating system, or even if there is a small time window between which the FPGA is already configured and the operating system is just not yet, and control is still not handed over. Microsemi, on the other hand, has no volatile FPGAs. So the threat is there right from the very start. So how do we protect against such threats? Well, one would think that all we need to do is switch the boot process, initialize the FPGA rather later, and then use, in cases where we have an IO MMU, we could probably use the IO MMU. But imagine the case where you don't have an IO MMU. You might be safe at boot, you might still be safe. But the same, you could consider such exploits to work later on during runtime. And this is why we propose a very simple countermeasure. It's just AXI wrapper for such cores. The goal of this wrapper is to basically encapsulate these third-party IPs or that have access to memory. And then you want to monitor the addresses it's trying to locate, it's trying to access, or even if it's trying to be active and it's not supposed to, and the length of memory that it's trying to access. So the way it works is you typically first configure the IP core to do its functionality, following which, as per AXI protocol, you would first provide an address and a request, and then you receive an acknowledgement, and then you go on with your data transfer. In the case that the IP core tries to access an unauthorized location, it again sends out a request for a wrong location. But this time, the wrapper wakes up and says, no, this is not what you're supposed to do, and raises an alarm. Then, depending on the criticality of your system, you can then connect this alarm to your security reset or just raise an interrupt. It depends on the application. So by doing this interleaving between the AXI, we're basically not affecting our performance. And the goal of this was to keep the functionality minimalistic and a small code base. So this way we can support really easy review and also reuse. Yeah, it's basically functional directly after power up, and we will make the sources available, and you can then later download it from our GitHub. So finally, this brings me to the end, and I just wanted to provide a couple of take-home messages. we all know system security is affected by malicious hardware. But now this is becoming really critical with these FPGA SoCs, where you can just, you have these additional players in your FPGA fabric. And when these FPGA codes come from third party, you don't know what's there. And remember, like with the case of your software apps, these hardware codes could also contain malicious functionality. As a proof of concept today in the paper, we showed you how this could affect the secure boot in such systems. At date this year, we also showed how crypto keys may be affected in a running system. So hence, we need to take care to protect our system by isolating such hardware cores. And for that, we propose to use our wrapper, or in other cases where you have more sophisticated countermeasures like the XMPU, you could use that. Thank you for your attention. And yeah.
Thank you very much. We have time for a couple of questions.
Thanks a lot. It was very nice, clear presentation. Only point I missed, maybe the details about this AXI wrapper you used. So,
sorry, I don't hear you.
So the detail I missed is the actual functionality of the wrapper. So how does it actually detect whether the...
Yeah, so the wrapper itself is designed with some basic configuration at design time, so that is it has no access to anything. And then, like I said, it's then the CPU that, as usual, which wants to use this core, provides some configuration. Mm-hmm. And this configuration is then used as a wrapper setting, and it works based on this setting. Yeah.
Okay.
Does that answer it?
Well, I think I'll read the paper, so but thanks.
Yeah. You could also talk to me afterwards.
Okay. Questions? There's a question.
Thank you for sharing. A very nice job. Maybe I missed some part. I'm wondering that if I have a RSA signing of the hash, and if I don't know where is the public key stored, in the fuse or in the flash. If I could not get access to the public key, it should be we're
bypassing that, so you don't need the key. So
you have bypassed by the
yes.
In the
so
port.
what you have several possibilities. One way is to bypass it. So the public key in this case, hash of the public key is stored in some eFuse, but that's not important for us.
So there is no hardware boot code, right?
Yes, and there is some hardware boot code. Boot from starts it. Your first stage bootloader is then taking control. And then each stage is then doing a verification, and at some point they have to hand off control. And you can always, there is this possibility at the point where you actually hand off control, you can interrupt this part and inject new code in there.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? So I have a question. So you describe your AXI unit, the secure AXI access. How do you handle the case where you would consider malicious tampering of your bit stream, which may potentially get around the protection that you try to introduce? Is this a different problem, or is this?
Yeah, I think that would be a different problem, and that's the problem you're basically addressing with secure boot.
Right.
So your bit stream is encrypted and authenticated. So that's what we're already covering with secure boot. So
there's even a lower level secure boot process that this builds on top on.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, there's a question.
Thanks. In your slides, you indicated that the IP core has access to the Ethernet and can load stuff from Ethernet. Is that not also maybe even the bigger attack vector, that it can exfiltrate secure information to the Ethernet if it's directly and unfiltered connected to the Ethernet?
I think you got that slightly differently. The IP core by itself has no access to the Ethernet. The system, yes, has access to the internet, and what we do when we overwrite it is, instead of doing a normal load secure image from non-volatile memory, we're doing a TFTP boot. So we're just changing the boot parameters. And now if you consider applications these days, everything requires Ethernet access, so IoT.
Thank you. Let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you very much.
So I hand it over to the general chair.
And there's an announcement. So at 2:30, please assemble like outside the ballroom. I mean, we will be leading everybody out to the buses. And I remind you again that you are not allowed to have food, water, and large bags, particularly not backpacks. The assembly is at 2:30 outside, going out, and at 6 o'clock at the Palace Museum at the B1 gift shop, in the basement, the B1 gift shop at 6 o'clock. So if you miss the bus, you miss the bus. So if you have still somehow have hefty backpacks, we have a limited amount of storage behind our counter, and no, if you lose it, you lose it, but we have people sitting around. Okay, so now there's lunch outside. So please enjoy your lunch.